as I was saying, just so that anybody that is watching this later gets the same information, the plan is to have our exam number 3 not this coming Wednesday, so not during the week before Easter, but the week following Easter. So not this coming Wednesday, but the next Wednesday. And yes, that does get us very close to the end of the semester. There's only like a week and a half left after that, but that test isn't going to cover, is only going to cover material through next Monday, so this coming Monday, the Monday of Easter week. And so we'll stop, the material on that exam will stop with the divided kingdom, the end of the divided kingdom. We're going to finish out these prophets of the southern kingdom, at least the ones that we're going to cover on Monday. And then that will be the end of the material that will be on exam 3. And then we'll start doing the last part of the material. And so we'll cover the exile and the post-exile period, and then use whatever time that we have left, probably the last week, to look at the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, because I accidentally put that off. So that's the plan for the rest of the semester, but be ready for exam 3, not this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. Any questions about the exam or the plan? All right. Well, let's dig into Jeremiah then. Jeremiah is another of the prophets of the southern kingdom of Judah. Jeremiah is working and writing for basically the last 40-ish years before the fall of the southern kingdom, Judah. And so he's after Isaiah's period, and Isaiah has probably died by the time Jeremiah comes on the scene and is actually prophesying. There's a chance that Jeremiah and Isaiah were alive at the same time, maybe for a few years, but probably, or maybe not. It just depends on how the things fell out. But they weren't working at the same time. They weren't prophesying at the same time. Jeremiah is prophesying during the last 40 years or so of the southern kingdom, and his ministry basically ends when, after the collapse of the southern kingdom, some of the survivors try to make one last uprising, and when they fail, the uprising fails, they flee to Egypt for their life, and they kidnap Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch and take them with them, even though Jeremiah is saying he needs to stay and continue prophesying. But the survivors don't listen. They take him by force and drag him to Egypt, basically. So this is Jeremiah's end. This is where Jeremiah, what Jeremiah does, or the period that he's working in. And the southern kingdom collapses, and the fall, the exile into Babylon begins officially in about 586 BC. So that's the beginning of the exile. And as we'll see, there's a prophecy, or the part of what Jeremiah tells along the way is that the exile will last for about 70 years. And he gives reasons for that. God describes why it will be 70 years. And there's some ambiguity about that 70 years, because the exile in Babylon actually happens in stages. It doesn't all happen all at once. There's an initial defeat and a few people carried off, and then there's a bigger defeat and a lot more people carried off, and then there's a final defeat and everybody carried off. Those kind of stages. And then the return happens in stages. There's a first return that happens under the priest, or during before Ezra, before the priest Ezra, and then Ezra also leads another band to come and to assist in the reconstruction of the temple. And then later there's another return with the governor Nehemiah, and we'll look at that stuff when we look at the period of the return. But the ambiguity over that 70 years, when it begins and when it ends, does it begin during which of these phases of deportation or exile does it begin, and then during which of the phases of return does it end? It's a little ambiguous. There's a little ambiguity there, but 70 years is what they're told. And the book of Jeremiah is basically kind of divided up into some sort of sensible sections. There's a group of 24 chapters. The first 24 chapters seem to be happening during the period of Jeremiah's ministry that leads up to the Babylonian exile. So the first 35 years of his ministry, those first 35 years before Babylonians are knocking at the gates. And then there's after the first 24 chapters, there's a short section of prophecies or messages that are full of hope and consolation for those that are being carried off or have been carried off into exile. So we have kind of that division, a little bit like in Isaiah, that there's, you got the first several chapters, first 39 chapters that seem to deal with pre-exile, and then the last thing in that first 39 chapters in Isaiah is the Babylonians coming to visit and Hezekiah showing them all the riches of the kingdom. And that's kind of the hint. This is where Babylon comes in, even though Isaiah is living well before Babylon happens. But there's the hint that Babylonians are coming, and promise that the Babylonians will be the ones to carry them into captivity. And then after that, 40 on in Isaiah is much more focused on messages for those who are already in exile, and giving hope and consolation to those that are in exile, promise that God will bring them back. So we get a similar kind of division in Jeremiah. We got all these messages for those who are in Judah, these kind of straight down fly right or else kind of judgment warnings messages. And then there's a point where Jeremiah is writing messages primarily to those that are already in exile or about to be taken into exile. And then at the end, we see another kind of division, this last section that recounts how the book is put together. And then it talks about how this book Jeremiah came to be, and then recounts several stories about Jeremiah delivering messages and showing God's judgment coming, and the final fall and of Judah and the things that Jeremiah endures around that. And then finally, there's a section, several chapters at the end of the book that are judgments on all the nations, especially Babylon. Because even though God is using Babylon to do all these things, to fulfill all that he intends for Judah, he's using Babylon to punish them for their sins and their failures. He's not happy with Babylon and their evil. He'll use them, but he doesn't condone them. And so that's kind of the roadmap. As mentioned in chapter 36, there is a kind of description of how this book came to be, at least a partial description. God tells Jeremiah to take the messages that he has been called to deliver and to write them down and assemble them into a scroll and send them to the king. And so he hires a scribe named Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H. He hires a scribe named Baruch and tells him to write down all these words and compile the messages that he's made over the first 20 years or so of his ministry. And so he does. Baruch compiles all these things that Jeremiah said, and then there's a copy of this scroll that's made and sent to the king at the time, who was Jehoiakim. Not to be confused with Jehoiachin, the one that's carried off and imprisoned and then later released. We'll talk about him at the very end. But Jehoiakim, the one before Jehoiachin, he's the one that this scroll is sent to. And if you remember when we were talking about him a couple sessions ago, I mentioned that he so disliked Jeremiah and Jeremiah's message that he actually, as it's being read, he cuts off the bottom of the scroll after it's been read and throws the strips of scroll into the fire and burns them. So he doesn't want to hear it. But this command that God gives to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah hiring Baruch takes the messages of Jeremiah and assembles them into a scroll and kind of compiles it all together. And so that's how we end up with this scroll. And we kind of expect that. That's kind of the system or the way that we expect the written prophets to work. It's a compilation of their writings during the entirety of their ministry, entirety of the time that God is using them as a prophet, compiled together into a scroll. It's just this time we're given very explicit view of that happening. We're being told that this is happening. This is how it's being put together. And it's specifically commanded by God. Jeremiah is specifically commanded to do this for the purpose of sending it to the wayward king at the time. And so Jeremiah is, as most of the written prophets are, is a compilation of his writings. It's kind of an anthology of his writings. So we're going to come back up now. We're looking at the first major section. This first major section is kind of what you would expect at this point. we seem to see this pattern in almost all the written prophets of, at least during this period, the divided kingdom period, this pattern of warnings and judgments for Israel, Judah, and surrounding nations if necessary, but there's this long section or a decent section of judgment and warnings about what's ahead, and then somewhere along the way we'll switch and there'll be hope and consolation for what's to come. That when all this is done, God will still bring the people home, restore them, and so on. So in chapter 1, we get the story of that was last week, or last time, Jeremiah's call, his call to be a prophet. And we find out that in the first opening words, Jeremiah is the son of Hilkiah, and either Jeremiah or his father, the wording is ambiguous. One of them is a priest. And so one of them is a priest that is qualified to serve in the temple. And so he begins to prophesy. The word of the Lord comes to him for the first time in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. And so Josiah is king when he begins his ministry. And he continues through the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah. And so it's during the reign of that last governor appointed by Babylon that his reign ends, or that Jeremiah's ministry ends again as he's carried off into captivity. And we see this, Jeremiah is very concerned in the first chapter as God calls him. He's very concerned that he is a young man and he doesn't see himself as being very eloquent. He doesn't speak well. And so God has to reassure him that God will take care of him. He will go wherever God sends him, to whoever God sends him to speak to, and God will protect him and provide for him along the way. And he's going to need that protection and provision because he's going to be badly mistreated. Of all of the prophets that we see in the Old Testament, Jeremiah probably has the worst time of it. And in fact, along the way, there's a couple of times in this first section, the first 24 chapters, we'll see that Jeremiah is really struggling with his call as a prophet, with his identity as a prophet. Is this, God, why do you want me to keep doing this? Everybody hates me because of it. I'm despised and mistreated because of it. Is this really what you want from me? And so he really struggles with his identity as a prophet because of all of the junk that happens to him because of it. The way that people hate him, despise him, mistreat him because he's delivering the messages that God gives him. But this call of Jeremiah begins with God saying that even before Jeremiah was born, God had created him for this purpose. That from the very beginning, this was Jeremiah's purpose. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And that's when Jeremiah comes in with I don't speak well and I'm too young, and God reassures him. God begins to give him some kind of picture visions where he sees things. One of them is an almond tree. So he sees this branch of an almond tree, and God says back to him, says, "You've seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled." And this is a proof, by the way, that God very much approves of dad jokes, because the only reason that he sees an almond branch related to the word watching is that in Hebrew the word almond for almond branch and watching are similar. It's literally a pun. God just made a pun for Jeremiah's first vision. So God likes dad jokes, and if you don't, sorry. Apparently all dads have their quota of them, and they must use them during their lifetime. And some are given a higher quota than others.
I mean, we're made in God's image, so that's why we have dad jokes too.
He is our Father in heaven. In chapter 2, Jeremiah begins to give these messages of judgment and the call out Judah for their various sins and failures, their rebellions. And one of the first ones is going to seem probably pretty familiar if you're keeping up pretty well. He talks about the rebellion against God and the idolatry of the people of Judah as being a kind of spiritual adultery. And you should kind of recognize that theme from Hosea in the northern kingdom. And Hosea is writing to the northern kingdom, and he's the guy that God has marry the promiscuous woman who is pretty much going to cheat on him, and then use that whole relationship and the children's names to demonstrate the relationship between God and Israel. Jeremiah doesn't go that far. In fact, Jeremiah is going to be commanded during the course of his ministry not to marry or have children. So he's not supposed to marry and have children as part of his prophetic ministry, that not being married, not having children is supposed to reveal or show something about what's about to happen to people. And so he doesn't get married, but he still picks up that theme that the idolatry, the worshiping of these other gods, and the depending on these other nations for their protection, the way that they turned all these other things for their security and their hope, and their meaning in life, and when they do these things, they turn to these idols. That's a kind of spiritual adultery. They are turning away from God and breaking their covenant that they made with God in order to pursue these other things, and it's like adultery. There's also in this section, starting in chapter 2 and several points along the way, Jeremiah will point out how kind of stupid it is to worship an idol when you know where they're made. If you know the workshop down the street where the woodworker, the carpenter fashioned this wooden idol, or where the metal worker fashioned the gold or silver idol, or you know where the mason carved the stone idol. If you know where these things are made, you know what they are. You know they're just hunks of material, so why do you think that worshiping them is going to do anything? Why would you think that a hunk of rock would want you to make a sacrifice to it or to burn incense to it? What do you think what benefit do you think you're going to get from worshiping these things that you have seen be made? There's no point. They are just things. You're turning your hearts to these things, and it's ridiculous. In chapter 2:27 it says, "They say to wood, 'You are my father,' and to stone, 'You gave me birth.'" So it's like, where then, when you're in trouble, they say, "Come and save us." So where then are these gods that you made yourselves? So it's just ridiculous to worship these things that you saw being made. You know where they came from, and you know what they're made of. And also we'll point out that they can't walk anywhere, so people have to carry them. So why would you expect them to come and save you? They can't even walk. They can't get to you. And so there's a whole lot of language and pointing out the kind of absurdity of worshiping something that as a god and as a potential source of rescue and hope, when you saw how it was made, you know where it comes from, and you know it's just a thing. It's pointless, worthless to worship these things. There's also, we've seen in other places, in Amos specifically, the people of the northern kingdom of Israel seem to have believed that because they were descended from Jacob, they were God's chosen people, God would protect and provide for them no matter what they did. It's because they were God's chosen people, He would provide for them, protect them, and nothing really bad could happen to them. And Amos makes it clear that because they are God's people, they will be punished for their sins. That there is no escaping or getting out of it because you're God's people. In fact, being God's people means that you are going to be judged. You are going to be punished. Well, Jeremiah will, again, pick up a very similar theme, do something really similar in chapter 7 and 8, primarily 7. And chapter 7 is frequently called the Temple Sermon. And it's called the Temple Sermon because he preaches it in the temple. And so Jeremiah goes into the temple, and he stands in kind of the doorway into the temple, into the area where all Jewish people can enter, where the Jewish men are coming in to worship. And he stands in that threshold, and he just starts shouting out all this stuff to the people, to the worshipers as they come into the temple to worship. And the basic message, what he is teaching in Jeremiah 7, this temple sermon, what he is yelling at these people as they're coming into the temple to worship, is that God is not going to protect them because they have come to the temple to worship, or because the city Jerusalem has the temple in it, this place where God has caused His name to dwell. And don't think that because the temple is here and because you come and offer these sacrifices here that you're exempt from judgment or that you're exempt from consequences. God does not want your worship here. God doesn't accept what you do here because of all the things that you do out there. because you go and you burn incense to and you worship all of these idols in all of these places, under every tree and on every high hill in all of your homes, you worship all of these idols everywhere else. Why would God be impressed that now you come and you make an offering here? Or as you have gone to idolatry, as you have begun worshiping these idols, you also accept their practices and you turn away from the law and you're unjust to the people. You take your own fellow Israelites as slaves and don't set them free, and you charge them interest, and you oppress the poor. You do all of these unjust, evil things. Why would you think that God would exempt you from punishment? And he specifically points out there in the history, something that we kind of glossed over for time's sake, before David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, after David captures Jerusalem and turns it into his capital city, he then brings, after a while, he brings the Ark into the city, and the Ark and the tabernacle then are set up in Jerusalem in advance of the temple being built. But before the Ark and the tabernacle were moved into Jerusalem, they were at Shiloh, in this village or this town, Shiloh. And so that was the place where for a long time God's presence dwelt, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where God caused his name to dwell. And Jeremiah points out that God allowed Shiloh to be destroyed because of their evil. This place where God had caused his name to dwell, he allowed it to be overtaken, allowed it to be wiped out because of their evil. So why would you think that because God's name now dwells in Jerusalem, that he wouldn't also allow the same to you for your evil? So basically, you being God's chosen people does not exempt you from consequences or potential for judgment. It's not protection from God's wrath or God's response and consequences for your sins. If you sin, you will suffer for it, temple or no temple, worship or no worship. In fact, it's like God does not want your worship in the temple if you are not going to obey him and keep his covenant outside the temple. So that's the bulk of the kind of summary of the temple sermon, what he says inside the temple, and highlights that theme. And we keep seeing something like this in almost all the prophets, that the people are offering sacrifices to God, and so they seem to think that everything is okay. They can do all these other things. They can worship all these other gods. They can ignore the law and be unjust to the poor among them, and it'll all be okay because they are God's special people, God's chosen people, and they're going to the temple to worship God there, in addition to all the other stuff. And God keeps saying through the different prophets and using slightly different words, that's not okay. I don't want your junk. I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your songs. I don't want your worship. I don't want these things if they're not connected to your covenant faithfulness, to your obedience. If you aren't going to be just and love mercy and walk humbly with your God, then I'm not interested in all the rest. The worship and the obedience should come together. So that gets us through chapter 8, and there's several more chapters in this first section, and we get kind of repetition of some of those themes. In Jeremiah chapter 11, we get something a little different. God sends Jeremiah to specifically recount or to remind the people of the covenant that their ancestors made. And so to remind them of the covenant that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and the people made with God, that if they were obedient to God, that if they followed God, then they would live long in this land. It would be their land forever. But if they didn't, if they failed to obey God, if they chased other idols, if they didn't follow the commandments that God gave, then God would take them out of this land and drive them out. And they would be taken into lands that they didn't know, among peoples that they didn't know, and they would be exiled. And so all the way back as far as Moses told them that if you don't obey God, then you will not live long in this land that God is giving you to possess, but you'll be scattered among these other nations. And so all the way back to Moses was predicting this exile if they didn't stay faithful to the covenant. And so Jeremiah is reminding them that all the way back to Moses, you were told this is the covenant and you are to obey it. And if you don't, here will be the consequences. Well, after Jeremiah gives this set of judgments and warnings that if they don't follow the covenant, here is your reminder of what the covenant is. Here is your reminder of the consequences of what will happen if you don't. And so you haven't. And so here's the consequences that will come to you. And in fact, in this section, God tells Jeremiah to say, don't even pray for this people, because I'm not listening anymore. I don't want to hear it. You don't even pray for their deliverance. Don't even pray for them anymore. Their fate is sealed because of their sins, and specifically the sins of Manasseh, who takes the idol into the temple and then sacrifices his own son, potentially in the temple as well. But don't even pray for this people. And after Jeremiah gives that message, there's a group that is really angry about Jeremiah's message, and so they make a plot to kill him and tell him that if he doesn't stop prophesying in the name of the Lord, he's going to die by their hands. He's going to kill them, or that they're going to kill him. But God reiterates the promise to Jeremiah, reassures him that God intends to protect him. If they come after him, God will not let him be harmed. And this is where we get Jeremiah's first crisis with his identity as a prophet in chapter 12. So you are always righteous, Lord. When I bring a case before you, yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? You've planted them and they've taken root. They grow and bear fruit, but they're far. You're always on their lips, but you're far from their heart. And so he's like, what am I accomplishing, or what am I doing? What's the point of this? If the good don't survive, if the good don't thrive and the evil do, what's the point in what I'm doing? And so he starts to have this kind of crisis of understanding of his identity, of his mission as a prophet. And God answers him. God gives him a response, and the response is when we get to Job, you'll probably recognize the theme. God basically says, I know what I'm doing, and you aren't smart enough to understand it if I explained it to you, so just calm down and trust me. And then, you get, in Job, you get 40-ish chapters of discussion about what God is doing, and then God shows up in 3 chapters, basically repeatedly pounds into Job's head that he doesn't understand how the world works and doesn't know what God is doing and couldn't understand it if God explained it. And so, just trust me. So that's his response at first. And God continues to give messages through him. There are various disasters and issues that come on the people in Judah in anticipation or preparation for the Babylonians coming. They have droughts, and then there's as a result of the droughts, there's famines. There also there's diseases that spread. And Jeremiah is warning the people that all these things are coming, telling them that they're happening and why they're happening, as part of warning them of what's about to happen, that Judah is going to be carried off if the people don't repent. There's also several times in Jeremiah there's these kind of weird or unexpected picture prophets or prophecies where God tells Jeremiah to do something and then later tells him what it means. And so, for example, one of them, he's told to go and buy a linen belt. So go buy a belt and wear it for a while. And after he wears it for a while, God tells him to take that belt that he bought and go and hide it in a particular place in some rocks. And so Jeremiah goes and hides it and kind of buries it in these rocks and leaves it there for a while. And then eventually God tells him to go back and get the belt out, to go back where he got it and get the belt out. And so he digs out the belt and pulls it out. And God hasn't explained any of this, why he's doing any of this until after he's done with it. And so after he goes and digs the belt back out, having been buried in dirt and rocks for a while, of course it's ruined. It's decayed and it doesn't work as a belt anymore. And so God says, this is what this means. This is why I had you do this. I called the people of Israel. I called the tribes of Israel and the people of Judah to myself, and I bound them to me like a man binds a belt around his waist. They were kept close to my body, close to my heart. And I bound them closely to me, and yet they have defiled themselves. They have soiled themselves and made themselves useless. And what do you do with a useless belt? A belt that is broken and won't function and hold your pants up anymore? You toss it. It doesn't stick around. And so God gives Jeremiah this kind of interesting picture, this interesting way of showing or depicting to the people what their situation is. There's also another relatively well-known image that God gives. Jeremiah sends him down to the house of a potter, somebody that is shaping clay into pots and bowls and things, and has him just watch the potter for a while. And after he has watched the potter for a while, God gives him this message that basically what the potter is doing is what I do with Israel, or what I am doing or can do with Israel. And so a potter can take a lump of clay and out of that lump of clay shape out this magnificent, beautiful bowl to be used for decoration or even in the temple for worship. Can make this beautiful, magnificent piece of art. Or the potter can take that same lump of clay and shape it and mold it into a chamber pot, which is, their version of a toilet. It's up to the potter. The potter can choose what to shape the clay into, and if somewhere along the way the potter doesn't like the way that it's shaping up, doesn't like the way that the clay is coming together, the potter smashes the clay back down and starts over. And that's what's about to happen to Judah. It was God's choice whether to make Judah into a beautiful instrument, a piece of art for worship, or to use it as a chamber pot. Judah has so twisted and messed up what they were supposed to be that the time has come for God to smash the lump back down and to start over. And so God is going to cause them to be taken off into captivity and will bring them back again, and that will be God reshaping. God will reshape Judah and form his people again from there. And when Jeremiah shares that message, once again, there's a plot to kill him, hurt him, stop him. And Jeremiah actually ends up in an altercation with a particular priest named Pashur. And Pashur, son of Immer, the official in charge of the temple of the Lord, hears Jeremiah saying some of these things, the messages that he gives, and he is so angry at what Jeremiah is saying against the temple and against the people of Judah, against the holy city, Jerusalem. He has Jeremiah arrested and put in stocks. And if you're not familiar with stocks, it's like you've probably seen them somewhere in history books, but it's like two bars of wood, or in some cases metal, that are sandwiched together, and they have holes for head and arms, or sometimes for legs, depending on what kind of stocks it is. And basically, a person, as punishment, is locked in them with their head between in the middle, and arms locked over here. And the holes are big enough for the arms to go through, but not for the hands to come out, and likewise for the neck to go through, but not for the head to come out. And so the person's just kind of locked there in public, and that's where they are. They're just there for a while, for however long the punishment lasts. Sometimes hours or days before they're released. And so this priest doesn't like what Jeremiah is saying, and so he puts him in the stocks and locks him in. And Jeremiah is there for a good little while. And so after this, he is released, and this leads to Jeremiah's second kind of crisis of identity. And he's like, basically, I'm being beaten and locked in stocks and imprisoned and chained up for saying what you give me to say. And so, and I don't really want to do it. But then if I don't do it, if I don't say what you give me, if I try to lock up or tamp down the word of the Lord, it's like a fire in my bones. I can't hold it in. It comes out. And so I don't seem to have a choice. I don't really want to be a prophet, but your word won't leave me alone, basically. And once it's come to me, I can't not say it. And so, I have to keep doing it. But again, when he issues this complaint and says this to God, God reassures him, reminds him that God has promised to protect him. And even though he's suffering all this stuff and these things that are happening, there's bad stuff happening to him, God won't let him be overcome, destroyed. God will protect him and provide for him. So that's what happens. There's kind of the last, I guess, major thing in this first section. There's two more things in this section. Then Governor Zedekiah. One thing to note is that Jeremiah is not in sequential order. The collection of writings of Jeremiah are not in chronological order. And so sometimes you will get something that's given for Zedekiah, the governor, right at the very end of Judah, and then you'll jump back a chapter or two later and you'll have something for Jehoiakim that was way before them. And so it's not in chronological order. It's arranged more according to theme and the progression of the themes in Jeremiah, not chronological order. But there's Zedekiah, the governor, comes to Jeremiah and asks him to inquire of the Lord what the people of Judah, what the people of Jerusalem should do, because Nebuchadnezzar is knocking at the gates. This is right at the very end of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar has come and is ready to besiege the city and attack it. And wipe it out and carry off all the people into exile. And so Zedekiah comes to Jeremiah, the prophet, and asks him to inquire of the Lord to see what the people of Jerusalem can do to defend themselves, or how God, what they need to do for God to deliver them from King Nebuchadnezzar. And so Jeremiah goes and inquires of the Lord, and the message that he gets back is, I'm not going to do anything to deliver you from Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's here because I sent him. This is my plan. And so the best thing for the people in Judah and in Jerusalem to do is to surrender to King Nebuchadnezzar. And if you surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, most of you will live. If you fight against Nebuchadnezzar and you fight against the plan that I have made, then I'll turn your own weapons against you, and many of you will be killed. And so that's the message that Jeremiah brings back. And of course, Zedekiah is not happy with that message and basically treats Jeremiah like a traitor. And when we get down to the last section, we'll see some of how Zedekiah treats Jeremiah as a traitor. But we see basically God, the judgment of Babylon is God's plan, is God's will for them. And they should submit to it. This, I kind of think of this being like, any of you ever, get in trouble and parents go to spank you and you tried to run away? Did it ever go well? Never went well for me. It's basically, at some point you learn you just got to take your punishment, right? Or because if you try to get out of it, it's worse. Well, that's kind of the situation. God says, this is what I have done for you or to you. This is the plan that I've made for you. Babylon is going to take you into exile, and that's where I want you to go. That's what I want to happen because of all of your sin, because of all your failures, because you've turned against me. All of these things, this is the plan that I have for you. Your best bet is to surrender and accept it. Accept your punishment and go and serve Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. You were so eager to serve these gods, I have arranged for you to go and serve them, to go and serve these idols, to go and serve this king. Go and do it, and then when the time comes, I will bring you home. But the people don't like that idea, especially Zedekiah doesn't like that idea, and so he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar and tries to fight back. And it doesn't go well for Zedekiah, by the way. I didn't mention this detail the other day when we were looking at the history because it's kind of gruesome, but here it is. He tries to fight back. He rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. He won't submit the way that God has said through Jeremiah that he ought to. And Nebuchadnezzar actually gets so angry at Zedekiah because of his rebellion that after he rebels and after Nebuchadnezzar captures Zedekiah, he brings out Zedekiah and has all of his sons brought out and kills each of Zedekiah's sons in front of him, and then puts Zedekiah's eyes out so that the last sight he ever sees is the death of his own sons. So, yeah, it did not go well for him. The whole rebelling against God's plan and running away from the punishment that God had set in front of him, it ends very badly for Zedekiah. That's how that ends. Nebuchadnezzar puts his eyes out after killing his sons, so that's the last thing he ever sees. And then there's one last kind of scene or kind of important thing in this section, right at the end of it, chapter 23. We get the introduction. Jeremiah brings in the righteous branch of the tribe of Judah, the descendant of David. So when I raise up for David a righteous branch, and so we get the messianic hope being brought in at the very end of this first section. Then the next several chapters, starting in chapter 25, going through 33, we get several pronouncements or messages containing hope and the promise of future deliverance. And it's during this section that we get introduced to the term of their exile, 70 years. And that they will be in exile for 70 years, and there's a reason given for this. God had given instructions, commands way back when, through Moses, that the people were to observe a Sabbath day. That's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Every seventh day you rest from your labors and you keep it holy. So Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy by resting from your labor. And so every 7 days they were to observe a Sabbath day, a Sabbath rest. Well, they were also to observe a Sabbath year every 7th year. And they were to observe that Sabbath year by allowing the land to lie fallow, to not plant crops during that year, so that every 7th year the land could rest. And during that year, God promised that in the year prior to that, he would give them an abundance, and then they would be able to live off of the abundance of the year before and off of what the land naturally produced. So, wild berries and all the kinds of things that the land would naturally produce. They would live off of the surplus of the year before and the natural production of the land. But for every 7th year, they were to give the land a Sabbath rest. And then every seventh year was a year of Jubilee, and all slaves were to be released, and all land that was bought for use from any family was to be returned to the control of the family. Land was not meant to change hands permanently in Israel. But God gave those commands, and then it appears that it may have never actually been followed. They may have never actually practiced a Sabbath year. But God notes that for 490 years, the land has not had its Sabbath rest. And so the land will get its Sabbath rest. The land will get 1 year of Sabbath rest for each Sabbath year you did not observe. So for 490 years, you have not observed the Sabbath year. So for 70 years, the land will have its Sabbath for each of those years that you skipped. And so after that 70 years, then God will begin to bring the people back, bring his people home. And, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of consolation and hope to be in this section, but it actually is. It's a term limit. This is for a time. It will end, and then God will bring his people back. And this section contains a number of other issues, or a number of other moments that are intended to be messages of hope. That they're told to serve Babylon and to love the cities and care for and pray for the cities that they're in when they're taken into exile, because when those cities prosper, they will prosper. And then there is, in chapter 29, there's a letter that Jeremiah writes to the exiles. Now the letter is written probably after the first batch of exiles were taken out under King Jehoiakim. And so he writes this letter during the reign of Zedekiah to the exiles who are already in Babylon, that were exiled under the previous king. And this is the section that is probably best known in Jeremiah. In fact, you may have all gotten a gift of some sort at graduation that had this verse in it. Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. That's probably one of the best known or most frequently quoted passages in Jeremiah. The ultimate irony is that one very hopeful sounding verse is surrounded by lots of reminders of the fact that they have been carried off into exile because of their sin and they're being punished. And so that's the context of that verse when you get it. It's not them at the very height of their life and looking to the future with full of hope and expectation, and God saying, here, I'm going to give you good things. It's, yeah, sure, you're in captivity, you're in the middle of no man's land and you're being punished now, but I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, and so on. And so it's in the middle of really bad things that God says this to people. And so this section continues through chapter 33 with several promises and hopeful words. And then there's, from this point on, 34 to 52, we get a mix of various stories about Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is prophesying. I don't have time to go into most of them. There was an interesting story with the Rechabites in chapter 35, if anybody wants to go back and check it, but it's not something vital. We also get in chapter 36 the story about Jeremiah being commanded to write these things down in a scroll, and so he hires Baruch as a scribe, and they write the things down, and then Jehoiakim burns the scroll as he reads it instead of preserving it and following it as he should. It's also, after this, we get back to the time of Zedekiah, the governor, and Jeremiah preaches or proclaims a message that God gives him, and so he is thrown into prison because Zedekiah doesn't like the message that he should surrender to the Babylonians. And so he's thrown into prison, and then eventually he's taken out of prison and then thrown into a cistern. If you're not familiar with cisterns, they're like a well, except for there's no underground water source there to feed them. It's just a dug hole that's meant to catch rainwater and store it until, it's not rained for a while and you need water. And then it basically kind of smooths out the water source between rainfalls. And so there's this rain, or this cistern in the city that has run dry because it's not rained in so long, and the king is mad and doesn't want Jeremiah escaping. He has another altercation with some priests and another prophet, and so they throw him in this cistern that just has some kind of muddy muck in the bottom of it. There's no drinkable water there. And Jeremiah is actually stuck in that cistern until the Babylonians come and overthrow the city, and then some Babylonian officials come and pull him out, realize who he is and the things that he said before somebody kills him, and Nebuchadnezzar gives the word to have him be protected, to not kill him, because apparently he has heard the messages that Jeremiah gave and that he was telling the people to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar preserves his life, and once after that, Zedekiah is punished. His eyes are put out, all that, and then there is just a few people left behind. There's not a governor over them really, but this band of people, this band of the survivors get together for one last attempt at a rebellion and fail pretty miserably. And when they fail, they grab Jeremiah and Baruch. They actually accuse him of being a lying prophet when he says that he must remain there and continue to prophecy. But they accuse him of being a lying prophet, and then they kidnap him and run to Egypt before Babylon can come back and squish the last vestiges of resistance. And then the last few chapters, there's sections starting in chapter 46, going through chapter 51, that are messages against various nations for all of their evil and injustice, not Judah, but all the other nations. And the longest, there's 2 chapters of that is specifically against Babylon. Again, that Babylon is not going to get away with their evil, with their sin. Even though God is using them, that doesn't mean God is happy with them. That God accepts them as they are, that they're going to be punished for their sin as well. And then finally, the last chapter is almost verbatim copied from the last chapter of 2 Kings. And it's basically that reminder that King Jehoiakim, after the fall of Judah, the fall of the city, King Jehoiakim is carried off and put in prison in Babylon, but then later, under the next king of Babylon, Jehoiakim is released from prison and treated with honor by the Babylonians, and eats at the king's table. It's that kind of just last glimmer message of hope at the end of this story that causes us then to look forward to God bringing people back from exile and back home. And that's it. That's Jeremiah in very brief, and we'll see you back on Monday.